Welcome back to episode 9 of the Progressive Democrats of Howard County podcast. I know we just released an episode a day or two ago, but as you said in that episode, it is a very hectic week in Howard County for the upcoming legislative session and many of the bills that are going to be voted on this upcoming Monday, February 7th. Last episode, we talked to you about a very pressing Police Accountability Board bill. Today, we're here to talk to you about CB 10, dealing with laid off hotel workers and the right to recall them. So before I get into our guest, who's been working very directly around this issue, I want to introduce our co-host, Hiri Hague. How you doing today, Hiri?
Hi, Jake. Hi, everybody. Welcome to another episode. As Jake mentioned, this is back-to-back episodes on important pressing county issues. So February 7 will be a very packed legislative session with the county council, and the topic of today's podcast is going to be one of the hotly debated bills, and rightfully so, because it's very important for workers. As many know, the pandemic has shown, in terms of the insecurity that workers face, has shown it in ways that that we haven't seen before, and so this bill that Jake mentioned, CB 10, would go a little ways to ensure that people who had lost their jobs would get a chance to get it back. And so before we get into that, we'll introduce our guest. So Jake.
Yeah, no, thank you for that, Hiri. And we are joined tonight by Tracy Lingo from Unite Here Local 7. She is a staff director for them, and she's going to tell a little bit about herself in the union and what she does for them and why this hotel bill affects them.
I gotta unmute. Hi, my name is Tracy Lingo. I'm the staff director of Unite Here Local 7. And so Unite Here Local 7, we represent hotel, food service, casino, and event center workers. Mostly in this, we have about 3,000 members, or at least pre-pandemic, we had 3,000 members in Baltimore, but also Baltimore County, Howard County, out in Ocean City, we represent the casino out there. And so we've for a long time represented the workers at what used to be the Sheraton Columbia, and it's now recently reopened as the Merriweather Lakehouse Hotel in Howard County. Also Laurel Racetracks, which is not in Howard County, but close to you guys, has been union forever and ever, along with Pimlico. So I'm the staff director, which means I do all kinds of, we're a little local, so we do everything. There's no job too small and no job too big. So I represent workers, I train leaders, I train staff, I bargain contracts, and try to help pass legislation. We also are very proud to have sued Governor Hogan last year when he tried to deny everyone's unemployment illegally, and which we won. Which was a great victory, not just for hospitality workers, but that helped all workers to run unemployment during COVID.
Yeah, thank you. And, you mentioned that the hotel, now called Merriweather Lakehouse Hotel, but before the Columbia Sheraton, it was unionized. And is it true that until very recently, it was the only unionized hotel workforce in Howard County?
That is true. It's the only one that's currently has a union. Yeah.
Okay. And so, in terms of why this bill was introduced, how this became a big issue in our county, obviously there is the pandemic, but what happened specifically with this Merriweather Lakehouse Hotel or the Columbia Sheraton with their unionized workforce? What happened recently with that transfer of ownership that caused this to sort of become an issue in the county? Oh, you're on mute. Yeah.
I think what's happening with the Merriweather Lakehouse workers is it's kind of a good case study or microcosm of like what Harry was saying is happening in the hospitality industry and how that relates to workers' power and also to inequality. So the folks at the then Sheraton Columbia, they organized, I believe it was in 2008 or 9, actually. For a minute, they were actually part of the DC Hotel Workers Local 25, and then they became part of our local as the sort of how we divide up Maryland changed. But the folks who work there are a really inspiring mix of people that are very representative of the hospitality industry in Maryland and particularly in Howard County. So there's a great group of, as you would think, a very great fierce group of Salvadoran workers there. There's a cool group of Haitian workers there. There's a bunch of Ethiopian and Eritrean workers there. There's African-American workers. There's some white workers who've lived in Howard County for a super long time. Some West African folks, some Asian folks, I think a couple of Indian folks. And so it's really multicultural group of people, a lot of recent immigrants. Folks there organized, for the reasons that people organize, because that hotel, hotels charge a lot, they make a lot of money, and that money was not going to the workers, and also for health insurance, for respect, for dignity, and for some stability at work, that they couldn't be targeted or harassed. I think also like scheduling is a huge issue often, almost always, for hospitality workers, because so much, it's a real place where favoritism and retaliation from your employer can make a big difference in terms of whether you get scheduled for work or not, which obviously has like a real world bread and butter impact on people. So folks had the union for a long time. We've actually been through several different owners. I think one thing that gets a little bit into like the boring nitty gritty of our world as hotel workers is that that would be good for your podcast listeners to know, is that when you drive down the highway and you see a hotel that says Sheraton, like the Sheraton Columbia, that doesn't necessarily mean that the workers work for Sheraton. In fact, in most cases, they don't. In the world of thinking about inequality, it is, and I think probably this is kind of interesting to your podcast listeners, more and more what we're finding is that these hotels are not owned by one of the big 4 corporations, which at this point is, Hyatt, Hilton. Actually, Starwood used to be, Sheraton used to be a brand of Starwood, but in I believe it was 2018, Marriott actually bought all of Starwood. So Starwood used to be Westin, Sheraton, the W Hotel, and Marriott bought all of that, which made Marriott the largest hotel corporation in the world. But lots of times folks the hotels aren't actually owned by those brands. They're owned either by sometimes local investors or a lot of times private equity. We just had a really big, interesting fight in Baltimore with the Marriott waterfront there that's actually owned by UBS, which is a huge multinational private equity group. And then what happens is these owners, whether they're a big private equity group or they're kind of a local owner like David Costello, who owns the Merriweather Lakehouse Hotel, what they do is they don't employ the workers directly. They subcontract with a management company. In this case, in the case of what's now the Merriweather, it used to be a company called Interstate that was the management company. Now it's a company called Aimbridge. But really, it's a little bit of a red herring. What we know in the hotel industry is that the owner, not surprisingly, the person who owns the building, is really almost always the person who pulls the strings, and sort of having the workers work for a different entity is often a little bit of a way for owners to insulate themselves from accountability and responsibility. Oddly, David Costello seems to not, he just kind of skips that step and sort of admits that he's pulling the strings, which makes it kind of fun. But anyway.
Yeah, it's hard when it's called Costello Construction to hide that he's attached to it.
Right, and I mean, he basically has said that he's the person deciding whether or not to rehire people. So we may as well just all talk about what's real. So like I said, even before David Costello bought that hotel had been through several different rounds of ownership and management companies, but the workers were able, in our union contract, we had really good language, what's a thing called the successorship language, which says the next company, if a company buys the hotel, the company that's selling the hotel has to make sure that in the sale agreement, it says part of buying this hotel is everyone here who's working keeps their jobs, and you have to assume the union contract. So Costello, when he bought it, was kind of stuck with the union and the union contract and the workers and people, and that may, create a huge amount of consistency for those workers. There's some folks who, especially a lot of the banquet workers who, Elaine, who's been there, Angela, who's been there, they have been there literally since it was owned by Rouse Corporation and was, I think it was called the Howard Inn or something. It was like a very local name. So that really was the case. And even before the pandemic, when Costello first started talking about renovations, initially what he was talking about doing was not closing the hotel entirely, but doing the renovations in sort of phases so that they'd renovate part of the building and they would maybe have to lay off some people for some amount of time, but basically keep people working. And then, what happened is when the pandemic happened, those workers all got laid off. And this happened, obviously in our whole membership. In March and April of 2020, we had 95% of our membership was laid off. I think the 5% that wasn't laid off was the workers at Sky Chef that do the lunches for airplanes. And actually, they were laid off, but because they got sort of an early round of PPP money, because they're the airline industry, their company was paying them even though they were laid off. So the hospitality industry virtually closed down. Pretty much all hotel workers were laid off. And that's what happened. So the workers at the Merriweather, at that point, they got letters saying, you're laid off, and when this thing is over, we'll bring you back. And that was sort of at the time that we sort of, all of us sort of thought, oh yeah, it's going to be 2 weeks, 3 weeks, a month, and we're all going to go back to normal. And then obviously that didn't happen. And in the case of so what we all sort of learned in that moment, I think, for union workers, recall is a concept that we negotiate in pretty much all of our union contracts. So pretty much all union contracts have some language around what happens if there's a layoff for whatever reason. We've never previously encountered a pandemic as a reason, but like in the case of a closure of a hotel and a renovation, there's language about if workers are laid off, they have X number of months, and then they have to be recalled where they maintain the right to be recalled when there's work available, and you have to lay off the newest people first and rehire the most senior people first, right? Kind of. So most of our union contracts have that right, but because that language is really sort of more based on like a slowdown of business or a renovation, pretty much all of our union contracts is pretty common for most unions in most industries. The contracts had a limit on that recall. Sometimes it was 6 months, sometimes it was a year. And then, of course, for non-union workers in the industry, there's just no rules. There's this no guarantee at all for non-union workers about what happens if you're laid off. Your boss has no obligation whatsoever to rehire you. So you could get laid off, even though you were a perfectly great employee, you could get laid off, and your boss can decide, as if you were a new person, whether they want to bring you back or just have somebody totally new come in. So we started, realizing this is going to be a problem for both union and non-union workers as the pandemic went on, and so did other people in our union. And so started talking to different politicians about passing laws that would actually emergency legislation for COVID, because the layoffs were so widespread. And in a lot of our areas, just because of how work has evolved, a lot of working class jobs, if you think about it, are hospitality industry jobs, like certainly in Baltimore, but I think also in Howard County, the jobs that working class people rely on, it's not factory work anymore. It's hotel work and janitorial work and event center work and stadium work. And so last year we passed a law in Baltimore City that basically gave all hotel, janitorial and event center workers the right, those recall rights. So to say, and basically what that means is, it's pretty simple. It means if you were laid off solely due to the pandemic for no fault of your own, when your job is available again, your boss has to ask you first if you would like, you have the right of first refusal. They have to ask you if you want to come back to your job. If by that point you've decided that you want to go do something else, or you've moved, you can say, no, thanks, I don't want that job. And then your boss is free to move on to the next person or to hire somebody new. But the concept was, people shouldn't have to forfeit their jobs who were laid off solely because of the pandemic. These are folks who, were it not for the pandemic, would be able to continue working.
So Tracy, I want to touch on follow up on that, because these big businesses during the pandemic, a lot of the risks they faced, like think of the airline industry, for example, right? A lot of the risks that they faced, they have been able to either reduce it or completely get rid of it through legislation, whether it's state, whether national, state, or local. They have been able to get rid of that risk or reduce it significantly to mitigate loss, right? So these workers are simply asking for that, right? So you have a worker, so you have a pandemic happened, and they just simply want to be treated the same way that the corporations are being treated during the pandemic. They want to make sure that these events do not affect them adversely, as the same way that the corporations are expecting that. But my question is, there's this natural acceptance of, oh yeah, when this corporation is asking for it, of course, that makes sense. But then when this worker is, on the normal contract language expired, and so therefore they have to stick to that normal contract language in a pandemic. Why is that? To me, that's just inconsistent. And I don't know if you wanted to speak a little bit about.
Yeah, I feel like there's so many ways that you could go with that. I mean, that's a really excellent observation, and it's like what we see all the time in crises, that the corporations are very, very quick to want protection for themselves and very slow to allow that kind of protection for other workers. It just made me really think of like so many of the gains that so many of the programs that workers eventually were able to benefit from during that time, we had to fight so hard for. Like, people kind of forget, but the extra money for unemployment, the several rounds of extension, all of those things really happened because there was grassroots, often union led, but real grassroots worker movements to push Congress to include workers. And part of that was saying, look, these companies are getting, for example, the Paycheck Protection Act, millions and millions of dollars went, to companies. And what's so frustrating about that, which we again see time and time again, is the way that politicians talked about those bills is supposedly that they were gonna, the point of them was not supposed to be to bail out corporations. The point of them was supposed to be to keep workers on payroll. But what we see is, in fact, corporations get in there, they write the bill, they write the accountability, and then you end up with a situation like the Merriweather Lakehouse workers are experiencing where, David Costello, we talk about that he got $2.56 million of PPP loans for the hotel. In fact, he actually got 4 PPP loans, 2 for the hotel and 2 different ones for his construction company. And he said on his loan applications that he was going to use the ones for the hotel to preserve 129 hotel jobs, at a point where when he applied for 2 separate loans. The hotel was physically closed and no hotel workers were working, maybe with the exception of 1 or 2 managers, during the entire period that he had those 2 loans, from April of 2020, through November of this year. And yet somehow those loans got forgiven.
So do you remember, I watched the work session with the county council, and when the PPP loans were discussed, do you remember what he said the money was purchased for?
It's amazing.
The money was used to purchase?
What I remember him saying was that he hired workers to do cleaning, to move furniture in, to work on that stuff. And this is what I mean by what we realize time and again is this is what happens when the corporations help write the law. You would think that preserve 129 hotel jobs means like the same workers. Like that's what you would think in a logical way that means. It turns out apparently that's not actually a requirement of the law, which is kind of astounding, But yeah, because he sat there in an open session and said, I hired other people to do this work instead of the workers who were here.
He also said they bought furniture with the money,
right?
Which is not the purpose of PPP, is to use it for payroll, and they use the money to buy furniture, which is not what you're supposed to do with the money. So there's I thought that was very interesting. So
and I think that's where, like, with this recall legislation that has, so far Washington DC, also the city of Baltimore, kind of locally have passed these recall laws, but so have the whole state of California passed it, the whole state of Nevada and the whole state of Rhode Island have passed it, and then there've been about a dozen other localities. But that's, I think, the reason that we're seeing these grassroots efforts is because people have realized that workers are not going to come out of this pandemic okay unless we take action in our own communities to make sure that that at least locally where we can affect it, that the values that we want to have, that workers come out, if corporations are going to get bailed out, that workers also have some rights. We have to make that happen, or it's not gonna happen by magic.
Yeah, no, exactly. And well said. And thank you for, giving the history of this hotel. And to be clear, this bill, CB10, would affect all hotels in the county, but we keep talking about this Merriweather Lakehouse Hotel because it was, again, the only unionized hotel in the county. And they just, I consider what's going on here I think they call it the Shock Doctrine, which is when people in power, they already have an agenda or objectives in mind, but they know that they can't do it because it would look bad, or just now is not the right time. And then some other situation or emergency occurs, and they kind of use that as an excuse to justify their nefarious motive that they've had from the beginning. And I think that may have been what happened here is, let's be real, no employer wants their workers unionized because they don't want to pay their workers more money. They don't want to give them more benefits because it costs them as the employer money. They want to keep it more for themselves. But they know it's a bad look, especially if that is the only unionized hotel in the county. They know how bad the optics would be. But the pandemic gives them a perfect sort of excuse to have some plausible deniability and say, no, we're not anti-union. It's just hey, we couldn't afford to pay them. It was the pandemic. So really, this just seemed, at least from my perspective, to be a well-disguised, clever attempt at union busting. So my question, Tracy, is with this bill CB10, I guess it gives the workers who were laid off, priority in having their jobs back if they do want them. My question is, if, let's say some of these laid off workers who are unionized do take their old jobs back and the bill does pass, would they not be unionized anymore? Would they have to restart the process, try to form it again? You're on mute.
That's such a good question. I think, let me back up a little bit, because I think it is important to say that this bill, I think what's happened, there's been so much wonderful support of the Merriweather workers when people started hearing about the hotel reopening as the Merriweather Lakehouse and that workers were applying and not being rehired back. There's been such an outpouring of support there. But I think it really did also make people think about there certainly are other fairly big hotels. There's Turf Valley, there's a big DoubleTree, there's a bunch of other full service hotels where workers are facing the same thing. And we know for a fact, we know what happens when people have to apply for their job. I feel like this whole pandemic 2 years that we've been living, it's also what we watch play out in our country is a real master class in systemic racism and implicit bias. And we know that the people who are most adversely affected when they have to apply for their jobs, who's going to have a harder time getting rehired? Women, especially older women, people of color, Black workers, immigrant workers, workers whose first language isn't English. And so this legislation really makes sure that that's not what's happening to the Merriweather workers isn't going to happen to anyone else. That's in terms of the union busting. I think what is so infuriating about that to me is literally the only thing that calls into question whether those workers will have a union after the pandemic is the fact that they've been laid off for more than a year. So David Costello likes to talk about the contract expired. That's in all kinds of places, the contract expiring does not mean that your union recognition expires. Unfortunately, the only thing, if those workers have been working through the pandemic, their union contract, it did expire. Their union contract expired in 2019. If they had been at work, the company would have been legally obligated to re-bargain a contract with them. The only thing that calls that into question is that they weren't working at the time that their contract expired. The company, we asked to bargain the contract. The company could have chosen to bargain with us, as many other companies did. They refused to bargain with us about, and what they refused to bargain with us about primarily was the extension of recall rights. And in the maddening how weak our labor laws are, as Harry was pointing out before, that by itself now calls into question whether or not when the workers go back, there will be a union, which is crazy, right? So it's not a really clear question. The company could definitely say a majority of the workers came back, or a reasonably similar group of workers are working here and they could recognize the union. I think we certainly will reassert that those workers have the right to bargain with us, and we'll see what Costello does. And then we'll have to see whether the labor board sides with the workers or doesn't side with the workers, which unfortunately is sort of in this country a question.
Here, if you want to say something, go for it here.
Yeah, thanks, Jake. this last question brought up a really good point, in that, so there's a question of whether, when the employee gets, let's say they return, whether they would be considered part of a union. So there's that uncertainty, and let's say under that scenario, they're going to be going through hoops to, let's say if they wanted to unionize, they're going to go through hoops to get to do that. There was one suggestion that I heard about an alternative. So let's say a former union employee is under not under the auspices of this bill, but let's say they were not able to get hired. It was suggested for an alternative was given, that they could file a lawsuit to get their jobs to get their jobs back. That in and of itself seems very tiring and very exhausting to me. So what are the challenges that that workers will be facing, even under the best case scenario that this bill passed, to ensure that they have the protections that they had before, or some.
I keep forgetting to unmute myself. That is a really good question. I mean, I think like for our union, for the workers of the Merriweather, I think they're really motivated in making sure that this doesn't happen to any other workers, right? We are really aware that the fight to get the union back at the Merriweather is not going to end with this bill. So, I do think there's a couple possibilities. It's possible that the labor board would side with us and force Costello to sit down and bargain with us. That's a possibility, but that's a legal fight where we just don't know what the National Labor Relations Board will do. We'll have to see. Obviously the workers are concerned about retaliation. They've fought really hard. They've been really public. We've been on podcasts. We've been in the newspaper. We've been all over the place. And I can tell you that, they are concerned about, is that going to mean there's retaliation against them, or retaliation for trying to organize new workers that are there, which of course is illegal, but unfortunately we all know the protection for those through the labor board is fairly weak. And so there's another scenario where we might have to have a new election, or we might have to bring community pressure to bear to ask the owner to be neutral so that workers can have the union without having retaliation. And so we're preparing for that. And we really know that, Howard County, it is really inspiring. I know sometimes people in Howard County get a little bit like sometimes jaded, but I do think there is something kind of imperfect but real about this sort of call of like the founding principles of Columbia, Maryland, and the idea that the janitor should be able to live next to the CEO. I know that there's lots of ways that that's not perfect, but I also think it is kind of wonderful, like a founding community ethic. And I think the workers and I have all been really inspired by how much people have rallied around us and just said, this is not what's happening with this workers. I think the legislation is an example of that, just wanting to make sure this doesn't ever happen to anyone in Howard County again, but also the support of them trying to fight to get the union back, which is a separate issue, but we feel very supported, and I know that we all appreciate that.
Well, there's certainly a lot of support from this club, and one of the things I want to touch on is you've done several community rallies, and has been a lot of support from certain local elected officials, other organized labor, other organizations. So yeah, it has been encouraging to see the support, but it's very disappointing to hear that yeah, this might be a multi-step fight just to even get the workers their job back. We have to get CB10 passed, and then to get them their union status back might be another battle. But to sort of bring this back to, the future, as in, what's going to happen on Monday, February 7th, where step one of that, of getting CB10 passed to get the workers their jobs back. How do we, or how do you, Tracy, maybe expect that vote to play out? Who have been the local elected officials who have been supportive, who have been showing up to the rallies, and who are, the question marks, and where, we might need to apply pressure. And I'm sure we can get into what the people who are not for this bill, what their reasons for why have been as well.
So, the bill was introduced by Councilwoman Elizabeth Walsh, right? Who obviously has been very supportive and really with a lot of backing from Councilwoman Christiana Rigby. They've both been very supportive of this issue since it first came up. So at this point, so really moments before we started this podcast, Hari was showing me where to find the list of amendments that just came out today. And there are some somewhat problematic amendments, I think, that are there. At this point, I believe both Opal Jones has said that he is voting for the legislation as emergency legislation. I just saw that he introduced an amendment that limits the recall to 30 months from when the workers were laid off. So that's a little bit of a problem because the pandemic has been so long. So not just the Merriweather workers, but basically any hotel worker or event center worker who was laid off because of COVID in Howard County would have been laid off in March or April of 2020. So if you think about 30 months, that's, that's like this March would be 24 months, and then 6 months from then would be like September. I don't know that the hotel industry is going to really return fully by then. So that worries me because it really could jeopardize some people's right of coming back. One thing to understand about look, we're in the middle of the Omicron surge. We're sort of just coming out of it. I don't think any of us still really know where the end of this pandemic is. But the other thing to understand about the hotel industry is that in this region, the hotel industry is really dependent on business travel. And if you your other listeners don't pay as much attention to the hospitality business press as I do, but that has really not recovered. And it also takes, because that's like, we're talking about conventions and business meetings. People plan those a year out, at the very, very least 6 months out. And so you have to figure from when the pandemic, when things really get safe, which, like, who knows what that is, there's another 6 months or a year before business is back up to normal. And a lot of the workers that we're talking about are banquet work. Well, a lot of the workers are banquet workers who are directly affected by that, but also even the housekeepers and the cooks. If there's not that business travel, there's not going to be rooms to clean. There's not going to be as much food to cook. So I think we really have to worry about whether that's realistic. I think I had thought what he was talking about was a sunset of 2 years from the passage of the bill, and that doesn't worry me as much. But 30 months from when people were laid off is concerning. The other thing that's kind of been talked about a little bit is not making an emergency legislation, but that kind of, it does the sort of the same thing, which is that it limits recall. Well, it's a little bit of a different issue there, but bills that get passed as emergency legislation go into effect upon signature of the county executive, which would be maybe 10 or 14 days out from passage. Whereas if it's a normal bill, it goes into effect 60 days, really more than 60 days after the passage. And so the concern here is any hotel employer who wanted to would then have that time to staff up and hire workers. And then the workers who were laid off from those jobs previously would essentially be in line for recall behind those newly hired workers, because people can only be recalled or rehired when there's an opening. So if the employers are able to fill potential openings with new hires, then that's going to be a real delay. So that coupled with this 30-month from layoff is a real, those would be very, would be very difficult things that would really limit the number of workers that benefit from this bill.
Here, I saw you would try to come off on mute earlier. I didn't know if you had something.
Yeah, so that's a good sort of a breakdown of the where the bill is in terms of the different scenarios. Can you share, Tracy? Can you explain? So first of all, in order for an emergency bill to pass, you need 4 votes. So that's one big, major hurdle. And you mentioned that council members Liz Walsh and Cristiano Rigby have been working on this in terms of being supportive of it. So by process of elimination and just based on what I have seen from the council hearings, the chances that Councilmember David Youngman will vote for this is very low. So it boils down to council members Opal Jones and Deb Young. Could you describe, if there are any? I know that based on the work session and the public hearing, Councilmember Opal Jones did not say much in terms of sharing any thoughts with respect to the bill. And Councilmember Debbie Young discussed some of the concerns that she had. Could you describe some of those? You may say based on who the council member is, what the concerns are, and why those concerns might or might not be applicable or might not be relevant for in the grand scheme of things.
So I know that Council Chair Jones reached out to both me and also the bill sponsor Councilwoman Walsh over the last couple of days, and committed that he would vote yes on emergency legislation. He was talking about needing this amendment. I thought what he was talking about is a sunset of 2 years after the bill passed. The way Liz Walsh, the way the original bill was written, there was a sunset 270 days after the lifting of the pandemic state of emergency. So there was always a sunset in the bill. So I think whether it's 270 days after the end of the emergency or 2 years from passage, that seems pretty safe to me in terms of what I was just talking about the industry recovering and being sure people are going to get their jobs back. This information now that the amendment that he put in is apparently 30 days, 30 months after people were laid off, that's much more concerning. I honestly haven't had a chance to talk to him about that, and I don't know if that's really where he stands or that's a mistake or what it is, but we do need to make sure that that amendment doesn't get attached to the bill as it gets voted on Monday. And then Councilwoman Deb Young, I have not talked to her directly, but I know that she's talked to lots of different groups in the last few days, and it sounds like she also is committing that she'll vote for it. I know she was concerned about the emergency legislation before piece of it. More recently, it sounds like maybe that concern is been addressed for her. And so, yeah, I believe she's voting for the bill, and I'm not entirely sure if she has any amendments she needs, but that's something that people who are in her district communicating with her and asking her to let them know if there's any if there's any limits on her support of it or any qualifications, that would be useful. But my understanding as of where we stand right now is that she's voting for it on Monday.
So just wanted to follow up there, so that people understand in terms of the asymmetry, in terms of, if there's a good amendment, there's, the hurdle of it passing. So you need, 3 votes for an amendment to pass,
Yes.
right? So, you have a lot of the amendments from what I've seen. I think, maybe there are 11 so far. Most of them are not really that good. So then you have, you have the sponsor, and then just 2 more people, with some reservations for that amendment to pass. And then, there would, and then at least 2 of those would vote for the overall bill. So there's that, there's that downside. And then a good amendment still needs 3 votes. But then the challenge is, so far it seems like there are 3 people with some level of reservation on, about the bill. And so the chances of an amendment that strengthens it passing, is the challenge to be aware of. It just, from seeing the where people are, where the council members are on the bill.
Yeah. So I think what would be really helpful is, I think for your listeners to be really communicating with their council people. It's always a good idea to thank Councilwoman Rigby and Councilwoman Walsh for their support and for their leadership on this issue. And then I think I haven't actually gotten a chance to look at all the amendments, but the kind of things that I've heard of that I think we need to be careful of. We need to make sure there's no lessening of the emergency legislation. We need to be careful about, like, this thing about how long people have their recall rights. That's really important. The other issue that I've heard raised, I'm not sure if there's an amendment to this effect, is right now the bill will cover, is really meant to cover the broadest group of workers. And so it has an hours limit, like it covers workers that work a very minimal number of hours. So there's been some talk about raising the number of hours that someone would have had to have worked for the bill to cover them. For most of the workers, I think that's going to be fine. The thing that people need to understand is that for banquet workers particularly, banquet workers don't work regular hours. It's not like they come into work and they work every week for 30 hours no matter what. They only work if there's an event. And so I think if there's a move to try to raise the number of hours that people need to be covered by the bill, we just need to make sure that there's some amendment to that says that we just need to make sure that whatever that amendment is takes into account banquet work. So I think there could be something like if you worked, 2 events a month or something like that. But there needs to be some understanding of like per event work as opposed to like per hour work. I know the county executive put in an amendment that's just about which department enforces the bill, that is not problematic. It's not going to harm the bill. And then there was some talk at the work session. Also, the Hotel Association raised this issue of, well, how many times do we have to offer people recall? And I know, like, there's been, like, with the talk about the labor shortage, there's a lot of, employers saying, oh, we call people and we can't get anyone to work. And I think the issue there is, potentially, I can understand the Hotel Association's point that they don't want it to be a completely unlimited right. I think some of the earlier bills really did make that unlimited, but that was because they were passed in the beginning of the pandemic when childcare was a lot more scarce, and also vaccines weren't around yet. And so, people had very serious, like, frontline worker health concerns about going back to work. I think now, as long as we make sure that there's really good notification language in the bill that makes sure that employers have to document that they actually contacted the person at a viable address or phone number, And as long as people have like at least two chances, right? So that if for some reason you get recalled to your job and you need a week to figure out childcare, that can't be used as a reason to say that you've forfeited your right to recall, right? You would get one more chance after that, one chance of declining before you before you like forfeit your right to go back to your job. I have to say also that I just have to give a shout out to Colleen Morris from the Howard County Teachers Association. She's been super helpful in helping us lobby legislators on this bill. And I think she's been particularly helpful on that point because the teachers also in their contract have really good language about people being able to have some limited amount of flexibility in terms of if they can't return to work the first time they're asked, having another opportunity. I think the teachers have several opportunities, but she's been very supportive of hospitality workers having at least one opportunity to decline before, without forfeiting their right to come back to work.
Well, that's good to hear that, HCEA does do a lot of good work, and it's good to hear labor's having each other's back on this fight. And
yeah, HCA has been wonderful. AFSCME has also been wonderful, and lots of union members from their jobs have also been great.
yeah, I saw quite a few union members at one of the rallies. Just to mention real quick, there's 11 amendments total. 8 of them are from Republican. The one Republican council member, David Youngman. How the Republican Party generally feels about unions, not very supportive of them. So I don't think those amendments are made in good faith. And then we had one from the county executive and one from Opal Jones, which we already talked about. And then there's a third one from Liz Walsh that we didn't talk about, but it does address what you just brought up, Tracy. And it basically amends so that the employer has to offer 2 times the recall. And then it also says they need to do it through certified mail, it looks like. But to touch back to Huri's point, we have some verbal commitments from council members that have been skeptical before that they will vote for it for emergency legislation. But when Huri talked about it, it could very much be that David Youngman has proposed all these watered down amendments. Opal Jones has a watered down amendment, and maybe Deb Young, Opal Jones, and David Youngman all vote together to pass all of the bad amendments, and then Opal still votes against, or not Opal, Youngman still votes against it even with all the bad amendments. But then Opal Jones and Deb Young now feel comfortable passing this as emergency legislation because it's been watered down. So I think what Tracy said is important. We still have a couple of days before February 7th. I understand Unite Here has an email campaign so that people can email their council members. So we're going to be sure to share that. And, I don't think it says, oh, pass it with all these amendments. So hopefully the council members, get that message that we don't want this passed with all these poison pill amendments. But is there any other efforts that Unite Here is doing in this final hour that you want to promote? I know you all earlier this week were doing some door knocking in, I think, Opal Jones and Deb Young's districts. I don't know if anything like that is planned. You're on mute.
Got to get the hang of this podcast. I don't know if it's helpful, but I'm just dropping. I don't know if your viewers will be able to see this on YouTube, but I just dropped in the chat the Action Network to help, which is just an easy way to write your council people. Although if you're comfortable calling or just talking or emailing them yourself, you're welcome to do that too. We did a day of door knocking with PATH people taking action in Howard. That was really great. Their leadership on this bill has been really wonderful, as has the NAACP's leadership on this bill has been really wonderful. And Our Revolution, Howard County, and the Progressive Democrats, and actually the Columbia Democratic Club has been also very wonderful. So I think the biggest thing is given that we know these amendments are there, to be pushing exactly what you said, Opal Jones. Obviously I think we can count on Walsh and Rigby to not vote for these amendments, but it's always good to call and reiterate that that's what we want. And then making sure that Opal Jones, I don't have a lot of faith that any of us have much sway with David Youngman, who's Harry, he definitely said directly to me that he will not vote for this bill. So I don't expect him to vote for this bill, and I do expect him to stand in the way. So I think the message of like Democrats should not be helping a Republican stand in the way of workers' rights is a important, powerful message that we need to deprive him of 3 votes on those amendments. Because I without having looked at them, I am quite sure that any amendment that he put in is not a helpful amendment to workers. And then the workers and I are going to be there Monday evening. So I am always in favor of, especially for Democrats, if they're going to vote for stuff they shouldn't vote for, they should have to look us in the eye when they vote for it. So I think there's some power in being there Monday, whether you feel safe being there in person, or if you don't feel safe being there in person. If you come, wear your mask. If you don't come, being on Zoom, I'm sure that the council knows when people are watching. Right.
Yeah, and I just went to the George Howard building for the first time at the legislative hearing for this bill. I meant to make it for the rally beforehand, but I got caught with work. But it was my first time. Super nice building. I encourage people to go and go and support with the union workers. And my last comment before I throw it back to both of you for final comments is people might be asking, okay, well, you guys have told us what are the reasons that the legislators who are against this that they're saying, but then we also have these rebuttals for why they're actually not valid reasons. Like, so people might be wondering, well, what are the actual reasons why these legislators, won't pass this? At least the Democratic legislators. And Tracy, you might not know this about us, but a huge part of the progressive Democrats of Howard County's messaging is, we recently launched a no developer donation campaign pledge, and campaign finance reform is very heavy for us. And, seeing the influence that corporate and developer donations have on politicians. And so that is perfectly at play here. I'm looking at, Costello Construction, the new owners and developers who built it. They're big players, and I'm looking at their campaign finance records right now, who they've donated to, and it looks like Opal Jones took at least $1,500. Deb Young, and that hotel is in Deb's district, by the way. She took $2,000. David Youngman took some money. Former county executive Ken Ullman took a couple $1,000. So, as always, the answer is follow the money. Both Deb Young and Opal Jones, if you are listening to this by any chance, do the right thing here. Especially you, Deb. The community just rallied and had your back for your emergency legislation to fix the Citizens Election Fund, and now we need your help with this emergency legislation, and not a watered down version. Costello can't even donate to you this election cycle. That 2,000 was from last election cycle, so there's really no reason to be against this. Don't give your opponents an easy thing. And, quite frankly, nobody should be being a sellout here and just doing what their donors say. And last but not least, they should all be signing the pledge, hocopledge.com. So that's my last statement I want to say on that.
Just a plug for that. Actually, I'm glad you pulled up the Costello contributions, but another thing that people should know is that it's actually an LLC called IMH that owns the hotel. So if you look for IMH, there's more money. Then also the partners in IMH are Brad Canfield, who's runs IMP for Merriweather. And so if you look at IMP and IMA and Brad Canfield and Gene Parker, the amount of money is even bigger that's at play. But I think it is important to look at developer money in politics.
Tracy, I'm very familiar with all those entities that you just mentioned. I've started calling it a web of influence. That's in Howard County and statewide in general. I echo with Jake's comment here in terms of this is about campaign finance. This is about, the asymmetric power that corporations have versus workers. Workers have, just regular people have diffuse power. They can't really, get together in a way that corporations with concentrated power get what they want. And I think there's also sort of like how we view things as a society in terms of, when it's a multi-billion dollar entity that's asking for something, oh, that must be some virtuous thing going on there, versus someone who needs this, or to feed their family or to pay their rent, and then at that point it's oh, they need to stick with their contract, so there's this way that we see things that I think has an impact. And Jake mentioned the Republican, the council member who is who definitely will not vote for it. But I would add, for a long time, you've had I call them the corporate Democrats and Republicans working in concert to weaken worker rights for years. And this is just another instance of that. And we need to just by pointing out what the power that's at play here, that's influencing who that's influencing the various legislators. We need to so we need to urge that the Democrats who say if they say they're for workers, if they say they're for works for security, for income security, for improving working conditions, then this idea that you're going to get away by voting for weakening the bill and then voting for the overall legislation to deceive the voter will not work. And I think we should call that out, and just close by saying thank you for coming on, and it's been very helpful, very illuminating in terms of what you guys have been working through and the challenges, and we hope for the best good outcome on Monday, February 7th.
Yeah, and any closing thoughts, Tracy?
No,
you were great. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you for having us on, and hopefully we'll pass this bill. I also just want to announce we're going to have a rally for Merriweather workers on February 22nd. Whether this bill passes, whether it's slower or faster, we're going to have the workers are going to go back and do a delegation to reapply, and then we're going to welcome them all back. I think we'll probably have it at the kind of lakefront amphitheater that's over by the Whole Foods. But we can welcome them back. They're going to go, ask for their jobs back, and we'll see what their employer decides to do, given the hopefully passed new legislation. And if it doesn't pass, we're going to send the message that we're still going to keep fighting.
Well, thank you, Tracy. And, as I said earlier, Progressive Democrats of Howard County, you have our full 100% support. We'll try to do everything we can to make an impact. And when we share this podcast, probably tomorrow, we'll make sure to include the Action Network link in there. So everybody fill out the Action Networks or send your own individual emails, call your council members, tell them, vote for this bill without any of Opal Jones's or Councilmember David Youngman's amendments. And real last thing I want to say is, probably a lot of people watching this podcast might realize this, some don't, but it's just interesting to me that if that does happen, where Opal Jones, Deb Young, and David Youngman all work together to pass watered down amendments and then, pass that version of the bill, it's just interesting to me because Opal Jones and Deb Young and David Youngman probably all hate each other. They probably really don't get along, but that's the one thing that can unify them is, working to prevent a workers' rights bill. And I just wish that they could find that unity to support things that helped regular people, but all too often that doesn't happen. So with that being said, get out the pressure. And we hope to see you for episode 9. Follow if you want to become a member of PDHC, join our email list, etc., etc. Look up our link tree. It has all of those links, linktr.ee/HOCO progressives. And thank you, everybody. See you next time.
Thank you. Bye-bye.